Good afternoon, everybody. It's lunchtime for me. I'm here in Pittsburgh. We got an awful lot of smoke from Canada coming down here. Can't kind of got to stay inside and protect yourself a little bit. But today for lunch, I have my friend Andrew, who Andrew and I were bantering a little bit on Twitter at DDD Europe I think 2 weeks ago now. And I was excited to have him come on and kind of give us some insights into how he's doing some work around things like platform and architecture, and a little bit how I think he and I have some similar feelings about the nature of architectural practice shifting due to the way that we deploy software, the way that infrastructure is being used, and that there's new practices emerging both architecturally, operationally, and in development. And this putting different kind of pressures on our ideas of what it is to do architecture in firms. And so I'm excited to have him kind of walk through some of his ideas on that. And I do that. I have lots of questions and lots of suspicions, and I'm hoping he can help me understand a little bit more. So Andrew, can you introduce yourself to everybody real quick?
Yeah, sure. Cheers, Jabe. So I'm Andrew Harmel-Law. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a principal consultant at ThoughtWorks, it means I'm post-technical, but I'm still trying to stay as close to the code as possible. Most of what I do these days is I still do delivery. I work with all the time with clients. And probably what we're going to talk about, lots of the stuff that interests and excites me comes from all of this technology is changing. Everything's moving really fast and everyone wants to move as fast as possible. But things get in their way, and trying to figure out how to get things out of the way, but also how to make all the buzzwords work for people, because it turns out you can't just implement a buzzword, like do a Kubernetes, right? You can't just, It turns out that made your life harder, not easier. Yeah. Ditto for platform and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, but so what? I got it, but how do I do it? And I do that for clients, right? So, cool. It's typically one step away from the code. It's like clearing stuff out of the way so that the teams and the client teams can deliver stuff.
ThoughtWorks has always been interesting. They've always produced a bunch of kind of leading edge thought. I've always enjoyed many of the authors that come out of the practice of ThoughtWorks. A bunch of interesting people that I've worked with from there in the past.
There's a lot of, it's kind of cool being here, to be honest, because I think day 4 I got put in a project with Keith Morris.
Nice.
Who wrote infrastructure as code, and I was like, oh my god, right? He's a nice human being, right? So you just bump into people and stuff, so it's very cool.
Cool. Yeah. So before we get started with architecture stuff, I've been asking everybody, what is a platform? What is this thing that we're pointing at? Everybody has suddenly different definitions. Some very vague definitions, some more concrete ones. But what for this conversation, what should we kind of think about as a platform?
So it's a great question. So I'm going to go vague, but I'm going to be like actionable. So it's not what it is, but what it does. So for me, it's self-service and it removes friction, because lots of what I'm, like I say, my clients are like, we've got this idea, we want to get it out in front of customers. We've got some code, we want to get it, we need to run it, all this kind of stuff. And it turns out now that despite the fact that it's never been easier to get some idea into code and then through test and through, and deployed and scaled and stuff. I'm old enough to have used to work for Sun Microsystems I started my career in 1999, right? So we were the roller coaster was going up.
Yep.
Everyone was buying all of our stuff. If you were going to launch a site, you'd have to buy loads of our servers. You couldn't just press some buttons on AWS and wait for stuff elastically scale.
Yeah.
So it used to be hard and expensive and possible to go spectacularly wrong.
Yeah.
Theoretically, now it's not hard, but it's still hard because we just had all this other stuff, right? So that's it. Kind of self-service, reduction of friction, helping the value get delivered. That's key. But I think a lot of the stuff these days, people are like, oh, platform's like a thing.
Yeah. I think in the kind of the way that architecture is changing in relationship to what you were saying. So the first website that I ever built, I built it on JDK1. I built the web server, not just the website, right? Because I had sockets and stuff like that, but I built it all from scratch, basically. And and it was, somebody paid me money for it, and to put it into production, I had to call Sun up, and they sent me, a case, a motherboard, some, some RAM, a CPU, and I had to put it all together and rack it myself.
Cable it out.
Put the OS on it.
Yep.
One of the biggest websites that I ran for a big auction house in New York in the late 90s, they drug a T1 line into my house that was directly attached into the cage that it was in across town. It's just a completely different world, right?
Yeah.
And I think like one of the things that I tend to reflect upon when I think about how this is like changing or like helping people notice this stuff changes, like we kind of went from this way in which most of the software we were building, we delivered bits on a disk, right? So like you get a CD-ROM, you might be able to download a software package, but really like who is operating the software? You bought the software, you operate the software, you figure out how to make it work on your desktop, you figure out how to make it work on your server. Like not my, it's like all the original app servers were like this, right? Like they have the same kind of shape as what we would call a platform, but the people who are building that thing and the people who are operating were not the same people, right?
Not at all.
They were sold. And so you get this weird thing where it's like first we start delivering things over this new medium. So, it's the Netflix version, right? We go from CD-ROM to streaming of a lot of different stuff. Secondarily, because of that, and because of the nature of distribution and medium, we start operating the software that we're building. Like it becomes something that the people who are building the software now have to operate it. And I think like we've been recovering from that transition for quite a bit of time still, right? Like people still are trying to figure out how to do operations well and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think now that we've gotten these kind of more self-service access to these different kind of primitives, question becomes like, where's the value line? What is self-serve? How does it shape? And then sometimes I say, like, I think that like platform engineering seems to almost be like the revenge of architecture. It's like, you have huge amounts of architectural debt, and now you're having a hard time maintaining and operating it. I guess the thing we're going to do is the platform, which is maybe actually just finally doing architecture to this big pile of mud that you've been making for the last 10 years. I don't know. What does that kind of jive with the way that you're kind of seeing?
Yeah, definitely. Change? This is so Dynamo Mentalian calls it the new physics. It's like the world, the things aren't different, but there's an entirely different lens you can look at it through, which I think is super. Like just everything used to be hard and expensive and slow is now fast, but we're slowly figuring out what that lets us do and what we should do and what we shouldn't do, right? And there's tons of stuff we shouldn't do. And it's so the reason I think I started tweeting at you in DDD Europe was there was a few slides you had up which really resonated. One was, well, the one I want to talk about first is you went back to the classic quote from Werner Vogel's, right? It's you build it, you run it, which now means like, oh, I can build it, so I should run it. I should but the like as you pointed out, and it's completely true. Do I want to run it? Like if I build it, then it becomes my responsibility. Right? Maybe it shouldn't be my responsibility, right? Maybe I should figure out where the value is of what I do and put the value into that and build the stuff and architect, etc. There's some other stuff I can not have to build and not have to run. And so all of this is architectural, right? It's like, how much am I depending on? How much is mine? How much do I control? How much do I want to give up? Right. I mean, and it's really interesting. It's I've been lucky enough to know a load of folks from Netflix. So everyone thinks they're copying Netflix. You speak to Netflix people and there are a lot more, or they used to be when I used to speak to them anyway, a lot more lo-fi, closer to the metal than you would expect, right? They're like, I've seen talks where they talk about like tuning their, the OS parameters and the VMs and stuff. And everyone else is like, woo, Kubernetes, right? Yeah. Because they know what's valuable to them and they keep control of that. And they know what they do not care about and they don't want to worry about. And they just get someone else to do it, undifferentiated heavy lifting. Yeah. And I think this is the thing. So what was important to them was, and I'm currently putting this into the chapters of the book I'm trying to write at the moment. We might talk about that a bit, but we keep, we do this, we copy the things that other people do, but what we don't do is copy is this undifferentiated heavy lifting for us or is it not? Because and this is why I go to DDD Europe, because I love this stuff, right? Because people are like, oh, what's the domain model for EV charging, right? So
Yeah.
Barry O'Reilly's got a really good example in his talk about residuality theory, and he talks about EV charging. But the domain model depends on where you think the value is, right? It depends
100%.
on where you put the priority. Where you think your value is your area of focus.
Yeah.
Just because that's a thing in the real world doesn't mean it's where you want to put it. So your business model needs to tell you where you put money and where you shouldn't, right? Pay someone else to do it, right? What's undifferentiated? And I don't think we do that. We're just like, oh, you can do it. It's easy. I press the button and I've got a Kubernetes cluster. And like,
Right.
but maybe you want to run your own Kubernetes cluster because maybe there's certain bits which
Right.
you want and no one's ever going to give you,
Right.
But we don't. And this is where it comes back to me for architecture. We either don't think about them when we just do them, or we think about them not to the fullest extent or in a meaningful way. We don't. And the other slide that resonated on that you shared was up until, and I reckon it's up until now because I bang into this all the time. You had a thing which said build, test, and run, and you had an arrow which had build and test, and architecture stops at the end of build and test.
Yep.
Dear God, I told like that architecture. If you haven't got it in prod, how do you even know? Like this is what gets the reason I wrote there's a blog post which I can share, but it's on Martin's site. But it's like the architecture isn't thinking really hard; it's putting it into prod and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
Right? If you haven't closed the feedback loop, and that's bringing in systems thinking and stuff, just guesswork. And I'm terrified, especially because I work for other people. They're paying me to do it.
Yeah.
I don't want to guess. I want to put something in prod as soon as possible and find out that it sucks. Okay, right, it sucks. Right, we need to all that kind of stuff. Yeah. That I think that's the new physics, right? It's like if we haven't closed the feedback loop, it's not this kind of just conveyor belt to prod.
Yeah.
It's like put the thing in, learn. Okay, cool, right, and then you know where your edges are, where the value is, what's changing, what's not changing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're guessing.
Yeah. So, like to me, sometimes I think about like there's this in socio-technical systems theory. There's this idea called whole work, and whole work is this idea that like people working should be able to. Control's not exactly the right way of saying this, but the work that they're doing should be complete for them. Yeah. Like they should be able to complete it, right? And so this like shapes the system to allow them to see the nature of the work and kind of complete it. And so one of the ways I think about this in platforming frequently is I keep on saying to people like, your application developers, whole work for them should be being able to deliver features and functions into a production environment that adds value or allows them to differentiate value or determine what is valuable for a customer, right? And so the more you think of that in the way that you kind of might be think of like microservices, like independently deployable, right? Yep. Like that there are these like little tiny modules that are like capable of being deployed easily. The more you kind of align your architecture around saying what is the nature of work for an application team? What are they trying to do? Like what is the work they're trying to do? And how do we architect the system to allow them as much independence around that work as possible? Yep. And then noticing like there's some constraints on this. There's things like cognitive load. There's things like you were pointing out, like I have specific needs, so I need to penetrate deeper into the stack than other people. Like there's a couple different dynamic parameters here to think about, but it's not. It's about allowing people to move more freely and independently. Yep. Without getting like tied down to a bunch of decisions that are probably not the best for any one team to be making anyway, right? They're kind of cross-cutting concerns. So
yeah, no, exactly. I think that's, again, this is where I understand why architecture went where it went, because all this power became available, like in the old days, right? Nobody wanted, like you said, people didn't want, like if you look at the original, because remember when Java J2EE, this will show how old I am, but when Java J2EE came out, right? Yep. There was the famous document which were like, these are the roles, and one of the roles was an XML deployment descriptor writer. So the devs would write the code and we'd write, and then the testers would test it, I think. And then someone would package the jar, right? And that was like, it wasn't a Maven script. It was like a separate job. And you would write which JNDI, endpoint that this would be plugged into and all this kind of stuff. And then there was a deployment person and their job was deploying. So it was totally split out. Now we can do it all, right? Press a few buttons, it's just magically there. So that then architects are like, crikey, this is terrifying, especially like regulated industries. I was speaking to someone earlier from a highly regulated industry, and they were like, I really love your ideas about this, super autonomy and like verging on anarcho-syndicalist thinking. But that is just terrifying everybody. And I was like, yes, right? Because they like, but it's because it needs a reset, not just on the kind of over control of architects and architecture. It needs a reset on both. It's like a consciousness on what you're doing and what you're capable of and what you're responsible for as someone who writes code. And an associated resetting of how do we want to, like, not control it, because you now get these terms like guardrails and all this kind of stuff. Guardrails feels like someone's already figured out where the road is. Here's the road. You just need to drive down it by typing. Developer typey monkey. But it's not. You're finding a path. You're still getting somewhere. So guardrails is the wrong metaphor. But you do need, like you say, there's the individual me doing my piece of work, right, which I should have, like you say, a complete work, right, an element of a whole work around about that, so I can own the full life cycle and the full feedback loop and everything. But there's a bigger picture, and this is why Diana is a reviewer on my book, because she's like, yes, but what about people who are guardians of the whole? The whole, right? Not the whole of this little bit, but the whole thing. And that's right too, right? And those things need to be kept in balance and inform each other. That's kind of where lots of my thinking has come from. Because I don't think we need anything new. I just think we need to look at the things we use in different ways to try and say, right, let's stop trying to control stuff, because let's be honest, we can't control anything. You can't predict. Nobody predicted the pandemic and anything, right? I can't even predict how my software is going to run tomorrow, because human beings don't do predictable things. So let's, but how instead can I like give people the support and the guardrails and those multiple viewpoints to enable people to make a good decision rapidly, put something into prod, and then learn from it and bring it back and do all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So like I had I had this suspicion or this idea that I talk to people about sometimes. So one of the ways I try to say it is, in any organization, there's multiple time spans. And the idea is called time span of discretion. And basically a time span of discretion works like this. If I come up to you and I say, how long can you operate before a manager comes over and evaluates your work? That's your time span of discretion. So this is really simple for most development teams. Say, what's your time span of discretion? And the answer is 2 weeks. We do 2-week sprints. Every 2 weeks, someone comes and inspects the work. They look at it every 2 weeks. So I can do whatever I want for 2 weeks at a time, right? And operators probably a little bit faster, maybe, daily or something like that. Some of the tasks are actually quite quick. And obviously in an incident there, the time span of discretion is almost non-existent. You have to act directly. And so then above that, in theory, there should be like another time span of discretion, which is longer. And I usually think about this as being like, architects, 6 to 12 month projects, product management, product roadmaps that have these 6 to 12 month scales to them, where at the lowest level, like the firm can like be okay with there not being a lot of detail around what you're going to do for 2 weeks. Like you can just do rapid experimentation. But at some point, with a lot of architecture and product management, you're asking the firm to make a commitment to do something. It's not just like we're going to do it in one sprint. It's going to be like, no, it's going to take some sprints to like decompose this monolith, or it's going to take some time to containerize things and get them ready to go onto Kubernetes. And that's not something that's going to just be done in 1 or 2 sprints. It's a sustained effort that the firm is making, right? So, and then above that might be like a longer 5-year time span, where I think like the questions end up being something about like, what capabilities does the system have to have in order for it to operate at all? Over a very long time period, and sustainability and stuff like that. And so one of my suspicions ends up being one of the things that happened is that there was a collapse in these layers. And what I mean by that is you got like CTOs coming down and doing strategy for architects and for product managers, right? C-level people saying, like, this is what you should do with the system. And therefore, the PMs and the architects end up rolling down and start telling people what to do tactically. And so the individual teams lose almost all their autonomy because they don't have any time. There's no like space for them to say, this is what I do, because everybody's collapsed down. And the result of that is that you end up really lacking. So I call these ideas, there's tactics, strategies, and systemics, right? So there's a collapse of the management of the system because nobody's managing the system anymore. Nobody's saying, okay, what I should be doing is architecting and managing the system to increase the number of strategies that my firm can deploy. There's no one thinking about like which capabilities, not what I'm going to do with the capabilities, but which capabilities do we need to improve the number of things we can do, right? And so then as we kind of start fixing that, I think there's a secondary question which ends up often being something I'm interested in, which is, once we get somebody managing the system again, then there's another set of relationships that end up being kind of closer to what I think Diane is talking about, right? Like she's got a whole, but then the whole lives in an ecosystem. So there's like,
there's no edge, right?
Secondary question of like ecosystemics, right? So like at some level, there's stuff outside of the firm's control, but still needs to be managed in some way. It's partnerships, it's relationships, it's, all these things. And so like, firms need to get better, I think, and architects in particular need to get better at like seeing these layers and not just trying to be totally reactive. And that's not saying you shouldn't act fast or that you shouldn't be able to have fast cycles. It's just what's the time frame or the time span of expectation for return, I think, is something. Yeah. I don't know.
No, I totally agree. I think because this is what's the original idea for what I've started looking at was, because things were slower and because things were slower, things were more predictable, architects could say something and the cycle could be longer, right?
Yeah.
And now the cycle's got faster and everyone's come along with, microservices, so teams can be more autonomous, right? So so the granularity of architecture having an impact is smaller and lower, right? So technically you could argue, and I could happily argue that you need to do more architecture in more places, more frequently, more often, right? Evolutionary architecture's come along, right? So it's not like we design in the old days, in my start of my career, someone would do some, like literally, to quote an architect. Admittedly, I disagreed at the time, and I still do. But they'd go, the design is done as they hand over a slide deck, right? That's say the rest is implementation. And they'd be wrong, but I could see how they thought that, because in the old, you'd build it and it'd take 2 years and then we deploy it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But now it's we're admitting we don't know. We're admitting the timescales are shorter, but there is still a longer timescale, right? So there's all these things. So, and architects got caught, right? Architects or architecture had to be in all of these places, right? And it could have a significant effect, and it could have a significant cost effect or regulate. We could be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you could overreact or underreact, right? You could overreact and like architect everything for every opportunity and possibility. That's a fail, right? Because then you've done too much and you've overinvested in things. You under architect and you're like ossified, you can't pivot fast, right? All of these, like, and the strategy and everything, like, so it got really flipping hard. And I think, and because architects cared, like I care, right? Loads of people cared. They tried to be everywhere, and they just got, and that's when I knew I had something, because I drafted this blog post, or I wrote a Twitter thread actually with more of an anarchist bent to it, with a few like A's spray painted in red and like animated GIFs, and then Martin Fowler was like, maybe you want to put that in a sidebar and to talk more about architecture. But this is what was interesting, because I read a bunch of stuff about political anarchy, and I was like, loads of this stuff, and then you look back at the Agile Manifesto, you're like, all these things are here, right? It's kind of, we've drifted away. So, but people tried to be everywhere and do all of this kind of stuff, and tried to control it. And like you said, when you use the word control, like, it's not control, right? Because you can't predict this stuff. There's always a bigger system. Systems aren't bounded and closed, right? There's always something else. Like, again, Barry's got his example of in his talk where it's an EV charging system and someone puts ground beef into the charger, right? There's always a thing you can't. Something will come into the system and mess you up. Right? So how do you cope? You can't. And that's kind of, mine is like, let's admit defeat and then go figure out what we do instead. And it's spreading the knowledge, spreading the responsibility, spreading the idea about, like you said, the constraints. And what I'm trying to do is find a bare minimum, a core of practices and approaches and kind of perspectives, and then a suite of other things, because I'm currently writing a chapter which is like, there's a whole other 12 chapters in this book, but please don't cargo cult your way through the rest of the chapters. These are the bits I think are fundamental if you're going to take this approach that I think is useful to architecture. And then the rest are maybe you need them if you're in this circumstance. But please don't just, like, oh, well, adopt these other 17 things. Please don't adopt 17 things. Although it's probably, I was speaking to Barry about this, and Barry's like, because it's a good idea that people are going to cargo. It's a mark of success is how much it gets cargo culted. Like,
totally.
But yeah, so like these are the things, but it's that kind of perspective and view on things. It's like, let's not try and do things, but let's make sure we are, like you say, looking at these horizons, looking at these scopes, looking at these forces, but not trying to acknowledging when we can't control them, acknowledging when we can just ride with them, optimizing for the feedback loops, right? So don't try and, like, again, go back to Martin, right? If it hurts more, do it more often. We've learned that, right? I know it hurts, so I'm going to make it do it more often, right? So then you can do smaller pieces of pain so you can learn, right? But we know all these things, but I don't think we've yet figured out that they all fit together in a way, and then we just add more. Oh, a platform will give me certainty. No, stop.
No.
Platform can solve, the idea and the concept can solve tons of your problems, but buying something from someone is unlikely, right? You need to get lower down into this and figure it out. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a common theme that in my conversations with people right now is like, so the provocative version of this is I usually say to people like, AWS is not a platform; it is infrastructure as a service, right?
Well, to quote Larry Ellison, it's someone else's computer when he was buying Sun when I was leaving Sun. Right?
And so you still like have to put a platform together on top of it, right? The platform that you're running is the way in which you integrate these primitives and services that you consume from other places. Like, a bunch of people that I've talked to have this weird illusion where they say like, well, most of my business is just SaaS. I bought a bunch of services from people. You're like, okay, but did you write some code that integrates those services and moves data from one service to another? And like, isn't that the platform? The thing that glues all these little things together? Isn't that, you still have a platform that is yours and you have to operate it, right? Like they're not going to operate the glue code for you. So I think there's just a little bit of confusion there about, there was a lot of confusion initially about like kind of no ops, and I'm going to get rid of operations by giving it to someone else and stuff like that. So
the no ops thing was, there's a famous Adrian Cockcroft thing about where he tries to not backpedal, but like give them, like there's always the classic thing where like I said no ops, but I didn't mean what's happened. I meant Adrian Cockcroft, like people I've followed because he was at Sun when I was at Sun. I've never met him, but I've just following Adrian and his thinking has been super interesting to see what he is. But like, the no ops thing. I mean, there's someone I used to work with. This is reasons to work at ThoughtWorks, or indeed to get us to come and work with you. But I used to work with an infra chap called Gerald, and Gerald was like, it's not no ops, but it's like it's the thinnest viable platform because you're right. There's all these primitives, right? So don't reinvent S3, right? Don't make your own S3, right? It's like figure out what you need, and then on top of that, build the thinnest layer because you don't want your, even if you are consuming S3 buckets, right? But there's a standard flavor of them. Encryption's turned on. They're in a certain geography. They're not in, that part of AWS. They're here. That's the layer that you put on top of things, right? So that people don't have to think, right? And then they just go, oh, I'll have an S3 bucket brackets, which means it's pre-encrypted. It's this size. It's this, it costs this much money. All of that kind of stuff. But again, people just like, oh, I'll just do it. And then you're like, you've hand-rolled all of this stuff. Why have you hand-rolling? That just terrifies me. That's not a platform. If you've hand-rolled it, it's just terrifying.
And it's also like, it seems like it's hard to sustain, right? So it's like the traditional architectural concerns, like it's hard to sustain and maintain and all this other stuff. But then there's this additional kind of, operational architecture concern, which is like every time the operators are involved in an incident, they get flown in and, dropped into an incident and everything's configured differently. They don't know where anything's like, where are the log files, where, like everything's in a different place, as opposed to, oh no, like below the value line here, the standardized stuff, I know where, like I can find the log files. I know where the observability frameworks are, like everything's just there because that's doesn't have to change per project in most cases. And if it does, it's clearly documented that in this particular case, we're using some other logging framework, really, I think that just makes it easier from the operational concerns to kind of think through that stuff. And that's like, sometimes I say to people, like, I think in architecturally, platforms are often just shared patterns, right? So in other words, like, your architectural concerns for your platform could just be like, do you have appropriate load shedding in place so that when do you have different ways of dealing with fault tolerance? Do you how are those things working for you? And those are cross-cutting concerns, architectural concerns, and things that impact the entire business at a larger scale than an individual function. So
totally. This is actually, we're drifting it, and you can tell me if I misinterpreted this bit. But another reason I started tweeting at you was the three economies thing. It's like, at some point, I want this to be mine. I'm happy to take. I don't want it to be like everyone else's. I mean, this is again goes back to Netflix, right? They're like, Netflix invest in. They have some teams which build tools which teams can pick up as they want. But it's Netflix culture, right? If you don't want to, then you're free to do your own thing. But the thing that Netflix culture has, and again, it's like your three economies, is like, if there's a good reason not to follow the tribe or go whatever, like tribe's an uploaded term these days, but you know what I mean, just follow everyone else, fine, do your own thing. But you understand you're taking these responsibilities, and you have your like you say, the things will be principal surprise, right? Things are less likely to be in the right place or the same place, whatever. So you're raising your cognitive load, and it better be for a benefit. If you don't want that, don't do that, right? Don't. And like you say, and this is what again was interesting to me, the third economy, the area in between we've done it all for you and nothing, I'm hand rolling it all myself. That's when I was listening to your talk, I was like, crikey, I hope you aren't just. The terrifying thing about writing a book is you go to a talk and you just hope you're not watching the talk, which is just going to invalidate everything you've written. So I don't think it does, because I'm just like that negotiation space, which is how I kind of saw it, right? It's like some stuff is cross-cutting, but there's this like the force. What are the forces? And that's the approach I'm trying to pull together with architecture is, how can you provide the things, but without saying you have to do it, right? Like leaving, and hence they are anarcho-syndicalism. Where does the responsibility boundary lie?
Totally.
How free are you to go, we're going to do this or we're not going to do this? And therefore, how responsible are you for the consequences of that? That to me is super interesting. I'm just, can we have a way which is, making sure regulators are fine and making sure that the business are still happy paying us all of the money to run this super expensive stuff, which better be delivering value. Otherwise, what are we doing? With like bouncing all of this stuff, it's got to be systemic, right? You can't get one person in a room thinking really hard. That's impossible. That's never going to, and even if they manage it, some factor will change. Like someone puts ground meat into a thing and it all goes up. That's interesting to me.
So I think there's some really interesting threads to pull on there, right? Like, so the first one, because I've been holding off on saying this, but it's something that I was thinking about when I was reading your stuff. Like, a lot of executives that I talk to, especially early in Agile, we would go and we'd help them do Agile, and then we get halfway through and they'd be like, "But how do I tell them what to do? Like, they're doing things that I didn't expect them to do." I'd be like, "Well, no, that's exactly like." That's the point. The point is that you've traded off certainty of they will do only what you can think of, which seems limiting because maybe you can't think of everything that needs to be happening. But the result of that is that sometimes they're going to like surprise you. They're going to do stuff that you didn't expect. And also, like, then I say they get kind of like tweaky about that sometimes. And I go, let's go to the Agile Manifesto website really quick. We'll just flip over here really quickly. Okay. And there's this part of the Agile Manifesto. It's called the History of the Agile Manifesto. And the second paragraph says, now a bigger gathering of organizational anarchists would be hard to find. I mean, like, this the whole point was originally, right? Was this kind of idea of kind of like independence, anarchy.
You can't tell us what to do. You can't.
That's right. And so I think like the interesting thing to think about with the terminology you're using, anarchistic syndicalism, is the idea that in that frame, there's like mutual support. There's some form of governance. It's just not the traditional centralized form of governance people think about. It's about direct negotiation and a bunch
emergent
of
hierarchy,
emergent
impermanence of. There's a few things like there's a book which I bought which now costs a fortune. Like it's been out of print forever, but it's called Patterns of Anarchy.
Yeah.
So and I got there because I bought it and it was cheap. So I must have bought like one of the 3 copies of it. But Christopher Alexander in a pattern language references it like 5 or 6 times, and I was like, oh, this sounds awesome, right?
Yeah.
And I bought it, and there's tons of stuff about all forms of anarchy, right? There's like Christian anarchy, anarcho-syndicalism, what's the I can do whatever I like, and the other end of the anarchist political spectrum. There's tons of it. It's all in there. But that, like you say, that kind of the fundamental tenets, like you can't tell us what to do. We are self-organizing. We're kind of impermanent, right? The whole permanence thing is a problem as well, right?
Yep.
You know, so if it's been around for too long, it'll start, you know, whatever group is, whatever the hierarchy is, it will start sustaining itself, right? Well, exactly. Ossify. It'll start sustaining itself for the purposes of just because it's there, as opposed to whether it needs to be there.
That's right.
And I was like, this is like software. There's so much stuff. And then, like you say, then I caught up with this. I was like, oh my God, it's all. It's very interesting.
So I think, you know, there's two things that I would think about really quickly with this. One is when we talk about this idea of governance and self-governance in relationship to economic decision making, like one of the biggest problems in architecture, in my mind, has to do with the way that we've organized around certain architectural frames, right?
Yeah.
And I mean like literally the teams and therefore the budgeting of the business and things like this, the way the budgets flow into the teams and things like this. And that is that we've often separated development from operations, right? So in other words, and architecture primarily has been concerned with the development side of the house and less with the operations side of the house. And so the result of that has been, and I'm not blaming architects, I'm kind of blaming lots of people, but the result of that has been a lot of what we would call in economics, we call it negative externalities, right? Basically, the burden of operation has just been like given to another part of the business, right? Like that's not my problem. I don't have to think about that, right? And so the result of that is that people don't make economically viable decisions for the whole. They make economically viable decisions for themselves. And this is what we have to partially change. And it means that, for instance, this way we were talking about earlier of you build it, you run it. The trick there is to hear if you believe you have an economically viable proposition where you can afford to run it without externalizing the cost of operations onto another group, you own it and you run it, then great. Like I maybe you'll want to come and look at the platform later, but maybe you're in a hurry right now and you need to capture a part of the market, or you're trying to develop some cutting edge thing that doesn't quite fit on the platform yet. That's fine, but it has to be if you want to be independent, the value proposition and the economics also have to be viable as a whole, not as I'm taxing the rest of the business in order to do this behavior, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that's part of it to me. And then there's a secondary thing which comes out of this kind of anarchistic thought, which is this idea from Ostrom, and she calls it polycentric organizing. So what her argument is that there's different centers in any system. And so what she means by that is, think about it this way. There's maybe you live in a neighborhood, and that neighborhood's part of a city, and that city's part of a state, that state's part of a country, right? And her argument is that those are different power centers, right? Your neighborhood has a power center, and your city has a power center, and your state has a power center, and your nation has a power center. And basically her argument is that what goes wrong is that there's no clarity around what the different power centers should have power over. And so you can think of it this way, like the city over-determines the neighborhoods, right? Or the state over-determines what should happen in the cities. And so then the question is, it's very similar to some of the other stuff you're pointing at, is it becomes questions about what is the boundary around the neighborhood? What is it that should be governed by the neighborhood? What is it should be governed by the city?
And when should that move as well, right? This
That's
is when should that? I mean, it's interesting. I don't sound like it, but I'm originally from Scotland, and so there's a great debate. Scotland's a semi-devolved country as part of the United Kingdom, and it's the Parliament is in Edinburgh. So it's not a large country, right? And it's not massively populous. But there's island communities with very small populations where there's great big cities and all of this kind of stuff. There's a massive mix, and there's a great debate at the moment. It's like, how much do we localize? Have we over centralized? Have we But then if you over localize, then you lose economies of scale. And finding that balance,
that's right,
super hard. And I think, and again, you're always going to get it wrong. And so this is again things I'm trying to think about with what I'm trying to write and trying to make people think about, not just putting in some way of finding out where it sits, this pattern of responsibility and how much people want to find, but not stating what the right answer is, because it depends on your software, your architecture, your market, your teams, your culture, your everything, right? And it doesn't depend, and it shouldn't depend on, and you need to be able to sense it and respond and all this kind of stuff. Without at the same time, because this again, while I'm writing this, I'm like, how do I make this not so complicated that people are like, that's an amazing theory, but I don't want to do it because it's too hard. So keeping the simplicity, that's what's interesting to me. And like you say, when does something become too big? Because we've had too big to fail banks and all of this kind of stuff, right? It's really that balance and finding that and tuning it and reacting and responding appropriately to whatever is interesting. And I think that's where the anarchist thing comes most, and it's in Netflix's culture and other cultures. It was kind of in Sun's culture to an extent as well, right? The you build it, you run it, or the freedom and responsibility. It's not freedom without responsibility, right? I've been to the bar with Netflix people, and some of them were having a drink, and then some of their pagers go off, or it's not pagers, but their phones buzz, right? So some of them start drinking water because the monitoring has just told them that some part that they're responsible for might be
on the way,
right? And then they start drinking water for 2 rounds, right? And then their phones buzz again, and they're like, oh, it's okay. So things are fine because they've started drinking again. Apart from one person whose bit is, the part they're responsible for. So that was, to me, that's where lots of this stuff originally came from, because that plus Bruce Eckel constantly poking me to read stuff. But that you can't do this, like you say, you've got to, and this is hence there's the 2 key parts to that's in my blog post and going to be in the book. The 2 key parts are the advice process, which I've just stolen from trust organizations, and the core of that is anyone can decide, as long as, and there's 2 caveats, but anyone can decide. And I have loads of conversations about this because people are like, is it always anyone? And I'm like, well, for this to work, it is anyone, because that is how the power moves and makes itself be in the right place. And then you've got the other 2 parts, which are, as long as you seek advice from people with expertise and people with who will be impacted, people with skin in the game. So that bounces, right? It's like an enabling constraint and a governing constraint, right? The 2 things in balance. If you can't do that, that's fine. There's other ways open to you. But I think that's most suited for the systems we build and the environment we run them in and everything. And most of the the organizations, maybe you need to put not guardrails, but other supplementary things around about them. Explicit non-functional requirements. Heaven forbid someone write explicit non-functional requirements, right? The amount of times I go to companies and they have NFRs, but they're not really written down and nobody's checking that they're there.
Right.
But the things are there. There's prior art. Fitness functions to support them and monitor them, all this kind of stuff. But that's what you say, and because you can't get the right answer, you just get what you think is right, and you're kind of sensing and responding. And ideally, if you've dispersed this responsibility and freedom, your sense network is bigger, right? Because people can say, this feels weird. We should put our hand up and say, I think that over there, that seems strange. And I think that's with software, that's really powerful, because we can build a thing and run it, and we can change it. You know what I mean? It's not like we ship a product and we have to recall the cars, right? We're shipping software. So the physics, and this goes back to Diana's thing, the physics of what we build allows us to do this stuff, I think. It's really interesting.
So I one of the things I was trying to point out in the talk is similar to, I think, what you're pointing at is, so I keep on trying to convince people that part of this activity that you're talking about and pointing at is the definition of boundaries. So to be pragmatic about it.
Yep.
Sometimes
Yep.
what I mean by a boundary is just an API. Like an API is a boundary, right? The inside, the outside of the API, and like we want you to consume the API. We don't want you to go behind the API and consume,
all that
kind of stuff, right?
Yep. Yep.
So there's a couple ways of thinking about it. I think the traditional way of thinking about you can see this in typed languages pretty clearly. Like part of the tool sets of a typed language is basically being able to control the API so that it becomes enforceable in a way.
Yep.
Like you can
exactly.
You can say this has to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think this new way of thinking, kind of what you're pointing at, maybe what I want to think about is how platforms should be developed and things like that, is that the boundaries are actually localities of collaboration or discussion. In other words, when you publish an API, there's a couple of things you should be asking. Is anybody trying to use my API? Does anybody care about my API at all?
Yeah.
Have I attracted a group of people that want to use my API? Am I having a discussion with them so that this boundary becomes a place where we work together, not something that I publish and enforce, but that there's this negotiation that occurs around these boundaries. And then you kind of get this idea of like, okay, where should parts of this live, and who should be responsible for certain things. And then there's also this like idea that like how decomposable should my API be? Like, should I be able to like change the granularity based on my needs? Should I be able to have like a high level API that it consumes if I don't care?
I love that when you're like the self-describing nature of the API and stuff.
Yeah. So I think there's something in there around, again, this idea of this syndicalism and this governance of an API as opposed to the publishing of an API or the enforcement of an API.
Totally. Because this is, it's interesting. This is so the next chapter I'm going to write is about the architecture advice forum. So it's like a meeting where people come together to discuss ADRs, right? So the ADR is the form in which you take your decision. Anyone can take a decision. They write it. The other part of the contract is you write it as an ADR and you seek advice, and the advice is recorded in the ADR. So everyone can see it's happening. The first possibly optional element is this architecture advice forum, which isn't a review board. Nobody's approving, but it's where people come together. The cool thing is, and this needs to go into the chapter, the fundamental principle of that is that it's a meeting that's regular. People come together, and I've got an ADR, so I present my ADR, and you give advice, right? And we record the advice. But that's a gathering where we've got all of these people together, right? We've got people from other teams, people from architecture, people from InfoSec, people from regulatory, execs. It's amazing. But what I've seen is that's an agenda where people can come together. One client that we did this with, they were like, we are too tightly coupled. We used to be nicely uncoupled. We're tightly coupled. They had a standing agenda item, which was, where are we too coupled? So because we had people in the room and they could have just enough conversation to say, let's get together to figure out if we need to then go off into a working group to set up a thing to change the API, because we're the producers and we're the consumers. And that was that. Like I was joking to the CTO that I was beginning to feel a bit guilty because lots of the architecture I was supposed to be doing as a consultant was kind of happening without me, right? We were just stepping back and people were going, I like your API, but it doesn't. It was all internal, but we could. And so it was forming. The people were forming their groups and they were understanding. And I did some stuff on like DDD to help people understand how a nice clean API could be designed. But then so the architecture was still happening, but it was evolving and it was coming from the teams.
That's another key thing for me, right? Like the way that you just pointed to that is, I keep on trying to say to people, architecture is a capability a firm has. If you have no architects, your firm has an architectural capability. It might be a very poor architectural capability, but architecture is something that occurs in the firm. It's not a bunch of papers. It's not a role. You do architecture. And so like what you're describing, architecture coming from the teams and stuff like that, that to me is like, that is architecture as opposed to like, maybe theater-based architecture that we see in a lot of firms where someone goes off and makes a bunch of PowerPoint decks and then spends a bunch of time begging people to implement the PowerPoint decks and being confused why nobody wants to listen.
And this is the thing. That's the giant elephant in the room. It's like, we did architecture, but how? And there's a great Alberto Brandolini quote about what ships to production is the developer's impression of what they think it's supposed to be. Right?
Yeah.
That I was like, I've blamed Alberto publicly for this. Like that made me think. That pulled me up for months, and I was like, "That's true, right? If I is it irrelevant what I've done, right? Because I think I've done a good job, but if I fumbled the communication of it, who knows what got to prod, right?
Absolutely.
Probably my fault.
Absolutely.
So that kind of thing where like you say, it's there's a great Ruth Malin quote, which is can't remember what the quote is, but basically it's like architecture is about conversations. It's making sure the conversations are happening,
absolutely,
and inputting where needed and kind of nudging. But you don't have. I'm not writing the code, right? And this another kind of great. It's another elephant in the room of our industry, right? We think architecture is important. We don't think it's important. It is important. The code is important too. The understanding, the shared understanding is important. It's still a miracle to me that we gather groups of people together to collaborate on this stuff, and there's a shared mental model that is somehow coherent and gets into prod and runs. But like coming together to have that conversation and to do that kind of stuff and make sure that that works, that's the key part. And then it's already in the heads of the people, and then they're already going down. The next elephant in the room is, but otherwise we're just doing this stuff, but we're not. It has no impact. The architecture in prod is what is the architecture. And like you've got this in your talk. Eric Dornberg is a thought worker, has written about this. We kid ourselves that there's an architecture that's separate. It's not. It's just those are side effects or artifacts on the way to the thing that got into prod.
That's right. Yeah,
and
I agree. Yeah, and I think like the other thing is like so. I mean, again, I think that the way that we've structured architectural roles in a lot of enterprises falls into this trap to some extent. But so you get enterprise architecture and solution architecture, so two big buckets that we see, right? And neither of them really fits the platform paradigm in my mind, right? A solution architect's not quite right because they're very focused on a particular application team or a particular capability in isolation. So it's not quite right. And then enterprise architects seem to mostly be like an extension of procurement. They tell you what you can and can't use, but they don't.
And they represent the business as well, which is good.
Yeah.
Like I've worked with some awesome. I used to hate enterprise architects. It turned out I just worked with bad ones.
Yeah.
But and that's good because then they do represent the business. But then you're like, but why am I one degree? What I want them to do is facilitate a conversation with 100%. Me, so I'm closer to the business, right? I want to understand. I don't want to have a third degree removed domain model or some understanding of the domain. That's so I agree. You can see why all of these things, like because I'm quite interested in the history of this, you can see why they came about, and you're like, but we're solving for a problem in a system which is now completely different. The system is different,
100%. And I think the thing is that like some of the results of the old school architecture, right, are. Stephen Bungay describes this when he talks about kind of deploying strategy into a firm. And he has this he's got these different gaps, he calls them, between like the executive's understanding and the firm's implementation, right? So we could just replace this with architect and development team. And one of the things that he says is that there's this gap between expectation and execution, right? And basically what he says is like the executive or the architect says, this is the thing that should be done. And then they stand back and something else is done, something other than what they said. And he said that like the naive reaction to that is to basically add more governance. Like say, oh no, the only way to make them do what I want them to do is become more strict and more stringent. And of course the answer is the exact opposite, as you've been discussing. The answer is to go to people and say, like, how can I communicate with you better about what my intentions are? Did I miss something? Is the reason you're not implementing what I suggested because it won't work, or because you know something I don't know?
Right? It could be my insane idea, which is completely divorced from the day-to-day reality of the domain, the running code, what customers want. Right? That's just.
And I had this as a CTO. I had this. It was so visceral for me the first time I noticed it because I told this team I wanted them to build a certain kind of report. And I went away for like 2 months. I came back and they showed me this thing that looked nothing like what I had asked them to build. I mean, literally just nothing. And I said, I don't understand. That's not what we talked about. And they said, no, this is exactly what we talked about. And I was like, no, I'll go back and I'll get the diagrams. Like this is, and they said, no, wait, you have to listen. We built exactly what you told us to build. Yeah. The customers didn't want that. So we built what you asked us to do. We used a process to build what you suggested and improve it and make it into something that customers wanted. We didn't just stop because you had some idea.
Yeah.
We used the methods that you've been talking to us about to build something that customers wanted. They didn't want what you suggested. This is what they wanted. I was like, oh.
No, I've got a colleague who I need to, she's in the book, but I haven't credited her. So Munira Rahimi, she's a product manager, and she kept saying to me, how do you know? I'd be like, I'd make some pronouncement, and she would be like, how do you know? Yeah. And like, because she's like, her product mindset was like finely tuned. She's like, until you put this in front of someone, you have no clue. You're just making stuff up. Yeah, and that, again, Alberto is in the back of my head. Munira is in the back of my head going, but you really don't know. You're not sure. Yeah. Just get it in front of somebody. That's, yeah. I mean, the first chapter of the book, which took me ages to write, but it's kind of, it pulls together all the stuff we've talked about. So it calls them the 5 revolutions. I'm not sure the revolutions, but it's like the 5 resettings of common sense. Agile Manifesto resets common sense as to what's possible, what we should do. DevOps thinking and kind of stuff comes in and resets what we're doing. Product thinking comes in and resets what we're doing. Team topology / platform thinking comes in and resets what we're doing. There's 5 and I've only listed 4. There's another one. But the whole thing is, like, things came along and showed us it didn't need to be like that. And that's the kind of stuff. And I think the thing that hasn't kept up with that, and this isn't to say architects individually haven't kept up with it, but I think the general, the standard, what we should do hasn't kept up. We've just thought we can keep doing it like we used to do it, right? And then meanwhile, everything else, the new physics has come along, right? And it's like, well, I can snap my fingers and it's in front.
Yep.
There was in the old days, how did you know? It's like, well, it turns out I've got to ask, make a release schedule, and I've got to align people and, all this kind of stuff. No, now I just press a button.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? If I've designed for it, and this is again what's interesting to me, because each of those architectures, microservices and all that kind of stuff is the other one, right? So each of those things, the architecture of the systems we built changed to take advantage of this stuff, right?
Yep.
We changed to take advantage of like streamlined teams. We changed to take advantage of DevOps and continuous deployment. We didn't just take what we had and, right? Stuff changed. Yep. I'm not sure it changed up at the high-level architecture level. I think everybody else changed. And finally, I think things are reaching like you say, the architecture kind of layer.
That's right. I think it's a new discussion for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And I think, like, we see... So I liked your story about Netflix. Sometimes I like my version of that story. The thing that I try to say to people sometimes is like, headlights are better than airbags, right? So in too many organizations, like the airbag goes off because something's already on fire, as opposed to we have some understanding of what good looks like in operations. We know the operational boundaries of our system, right? Sometimes I say to people like, the problem with a lot of architecture right now and a lot of firms is they've watched people drive F1 cars, and they watch them and they drive the car really fast into the corner. And, so they go and they try to do it. And it's like, yeah, but the reason why they can hit that corner is because they know exactly how fast they can go into that corner. They know exactly, like they're within like very small calculations. They know if I go 1 mile an hour faster than this, I have some significant chance.
And they know how fast they can respond and all
that kind of stuff, right? You are driving a Yugo into the corner as fast as possible. And not only is it just not a very well-tuned thing that you're using, but also you don't know the operational boundaries of it, the constraints of it. You just like have never bothered to ask questions like, can I drive this into a corner at 50 miles an hour? And then you keep on wondering why you end up in haybanks. And it's because like you don't have an operational understanding of your architecture. You don't understand your operation, the software as being operated, right? Yeah. And this is the same story you get from other organizations where they're like, we brought a bunch of stuff to the cloud and we were surprised by the bill. Well, how can you be surprised by the bill? Did you measure the basic consumption of your application before you deployed it?
Another thing I've seen, standard addition to like non-required, but standard addition to my recommended AR architecture advice forum. Get someone from ops to put the AWS cloud charges from last month up on the screen. Totally. And people and it's not because people didn't care they were being flagrant with the money. They just were never exposed to it because maybe they were building and running, but they weren't seeing the cost. Right? They were like, what? How much? Like, all those. you created a bunch of read-only copies of a bunch of MySQL databases so that someone could see something. Did you tidy them up? No, I forgot.
Exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
but it's like this is the thing. It's easier to go, like you say, go right off the track, crash into stuff. We can
100%.
crash a lot faster, a lot
100%.
more expensively.
Absolutely.
It's bonkers.
We can cobble together some very complex systems very quickly, and they can spin out of control really fast nowadays.
And that's my argument, right? It's like architecture was always important. I'd argue it's more important now because you can go wrong really fast without a clue about this kind of stuff. So.
And so this is my other suspicion about this. And we should wind down a little bit, but my other suspicion about this stuff is that like, one of the things that we need to get better about is the application teams telling the platform teams what good looks like in operation. So I think that like when you deploy a new function to a platform, you should tell the platform what impact you expect to have on the platform. Right? Like, I'm going to increase the amount of people visiting. I'm going to increase the amount of database connectivity. I'm going to increase the amount of traffic. And like, you don't have to be right. Like it just has to be a hypothesis.
Yeah, but have thought about it. Spend some time thinking about it.
And so that, what you should have is people's beepers should go off because you're approaching the edge of what was designed for. Not that it's actually crashed, but you said you thought 10,000 people would show up. Just so you know, 20,000 people have showed up. The system was not designed to handle this kind of load.
Congratulations. It's just a test. Exactly.
And I just feel like that is part of what will, like, we keep deploying function without deploying operational clarity around it, right? And you can see it a little bit, like, sometimes I think of it like, one of the things that you see at some of these more sophisticated companies is a movement from like strict TDD to like actual testing in production, where there's a different set of criteria that are being, viewed, right?
Yep.
I feel like the same thing is going to need to happen around things like error budgeting, right? So we see this idea of controlling operational or non-functional development.
Yep.
In relationship to the outcomes. But if we could move that error budgeting from like a separate thing that happens to an actual part of how you deploy, so that now the platform goes, you're out of budget, you're out of error budget, or you're out of design budget. Like you designed for this and you're approaching the edge of that. You should expect something to go wrong now. What are we going to do about it? So anyway.
Exactly. There's some, just to close it off, there's again, it could be apocryphal, but I'm sure there's a thing I've read somewhere, and this is bad point. It's easy to say stuff. When you're writing a book, you have to find it. So
totally.
Rita, my editor, keeps going, well, you've said this thing, and I've spent the last 4 hours trying to find it, and you need to take it out of the book, or you need to do your own Googling. But I'm sure I've read somewhere that Google, maybe it's someone told me, Google, they'd architect for what they thought the target load was plus 10x, right? Yep. And if it was more than 10x, well, I guess a rule of thumb, they would be like, right, this architecture can't. We'll be amazed if it can cope with 12x, right? Yep. So they knew, and they knew they were Google, right? So they knew that like, let's not expect. But then they were like, right, we'll do a rewrite. When it gets here, you can't refactor your way to, some fundamental principles will have been put in place to make this work, and then we can't, right? If you're going to go to 100x, which is 10x, right? Then we're going to stop and start again. But I don't think that's filtered through again. Like people are like, oh, we'll just tune it. I'm not sure you can SQL tune your way out of this, right?
There are physics things eventually.
And at some point you're just like, right, okay, the fact that we've got like a Kafka cluster doing stuff, like just like you say, leadership elections and like synchronization of stuff means we can't. So you need to do something differently. And that's and again, it's architectural, right? It's that should be part of this thinking, and you don't know until you put it in prod.
And I think that as we've been describing the whole time, it's an economic decision. It's not like some sort of like, you don't need to build the most perfect architecture every time. If you think that only 500 people are going to show up to this thing that you're building, you do not need to architect it for 100,000 people to show up.
Yeah, right? I've architected for a system where we thought they'd get absolutely slammed. 17 users on day one, and we're like, oh, we might have got carried away.
Right. And so like that's the trick, is like, put a line in the sand. This is what we're designing for. we don't have to be right. We just have to know we're wrong, right? There's a difference there. And without the line in the sand and without someone monitoring the line, we end up surprised when the architecture doesn't work or the platform has a difficulty or the application does something unexpected and everybody gets caught in the middle of the night. So I don't know. That's one of the things I think about as far as like what we need to do for this operational architecture stuff.
Yeah, 100%.
Andrew, if people wanted to pursue this more, what are 3 things from the conversation you think they might take away, or 3 things that they should pay attention to just in general?
So 3 things. So that's a great question. And I have actually been trying to think about this. Number one, the kind of themes which have come out of me trying to write this. Number one, just admit to yourself you don't know and you can't control it. So instead, just do what you need to know to find out, right? Which might be deploy something or run an experiment or whatever, right? Number 2, accept the fact it's going to change. Because again, you can, even if you get it right, it's because you got lucky, I think, rather than anything else, right? And number 3, and this is what I'm trying to do a lot, and again, I'm trying to write it into the book. It's like, try and understand what you need. Like you say, we need to be profitable. We need to have jobs tomorrow. If we spend everyone's money, then we can't. That's what do you need and why are you doing it? Because the third part, and this again, I was putting this into chapter 5 earlier this morning. Patty McCord, who was the co-writer of the Culture Deck for Netflix, she wrote a book about how they set up HR, right? So you don't think an architect's going to read a book about HR. My wife's got an HR degree, but I'm super interested. But she's got tons in there about how they experiment with everything, and they experiment with removal.
Yeah.
That I think we don't experiment with taking things away enough. We add not every. So many of the clients I go into, they've had a problem, so they do a thing to fix it. And they have another problem, so they do a thing to fix it. Half the problem is they've got things fixing things when you're just like, what if we went cleaned the slate back to 0, or at least back to prune it right back? Because you're solving problems that your old solution gave you. That kind of stuff, I think, is key.
I got a great book for you to read about that. Or I'll send you an article, shorter than a book, because I think you'll like it.
I don't have time to read books. I'm trying not to read books because then I'm like, why am I late for this chapter?
This is Brian. Have you ever heard? Brian Arthur at all? Brian Arthur, talks about this idea that technology creates its own needs, and so the patching process you're describing. He basically says the further that goes on, the more likely the patch is to be. Not to serve a human need, but to serve the need of the system itself. And he basically says that the only systems that survive eventually collapse those complexities and don't let them continue to grow out of control, because otherwise you end up with patches on patches on patches on patches. And you never
it's why I selfishly like being a consultant, because I go every year, I change jobs. I just see, and because I'm a consultant, we're expensive. I don't get to see the boring stuff everyone's already figured out. I get to see the hard, gnarly stuff where someone's pushed the boundaries, which is that's cool. You get to see people go, I'm like amazed you even got this far, right, through human endeavor. Super interesting.
I think, so like I like, there's like a whole set of themes there, like autophagy and this idea of undesign. This idea that one of the ways of designing things is again, as you're saying, removal or changing the system by removing something to allow something else to grow in the place of what was there. I think there's a lot of interesting things to poke around.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it got things you don't realize your first job, but they get baked into you. The removal of moving parts from Sun Microsystem servers, rest in peace, Sun Microsystem, right? But like the culture, day one, it was imbibed. I had no clue what it meant, but they were like the fact that removing things could make the mean time to recovery and the mean time to failure smaller on a system, that was beaten into us. It was a Californian hardware company, right? So it was cuddled into us. But that you don't like, people just add, and you're like, stop adding, take things away. Right? Every single thing is another thing that could break. Stop putting stuff into it.
Absolutely, yeah. Cool. So, if people want to support your work or read your book or something like that, where should they come and find you, or hang out with you somewhere?
Yeah, they can hit me up on. I'm on Twitter. So at. This is, I need to give you this for the show notes, at AL94781, because I signed up for Twitter when I was a long time ago, and that was my login at Sun.
Cool.
So I stupidly didn't think people would want good handles. My Mastodon's on there as well if you want to be on Mastodon instead, or I'm on LinkedIn at Andrew Harmel-Law because I'm the only Andrew Harmel-Law. And so I haven't yet. The book, theoretically, the first 2 chapters, if I haven't terrified Rita, my editor, should be in early access on the O'Reilly platform in less than 2 weeks.
Awesome.
Fingers crossed. And in which case I'll tweet them when they go out, and I'll bore everyone to death by tweeting about them. If in the meantime you want to see it, the blog post that this is turning into, the book's turning into, is Scaling the Practice of Architecture Conversationally on martinfowler.com. So if you Google that, you'll find.
Awesome. I'll put some links in the show notes for everybody. It was awesome.
And feedback. If people have, I want, like, the whole point, if you haven't understood anything from this, apart from I don't know the answers, so the more people share, like, I do want, especially if the book is, there's a fatal flaw in my logic for the whole book, if you can, I've only written 5 chapters out of 20. So if you can save me another 15 chapters by telling me it all sucks.
Awesome. Perfect. Feedback. Early feedback.
Oh, yeah. Early feedback. Yeah. How do I know? How do I know this is a good book? I don't know. Like, get it out, right? So I'm trying to practice what I preach.
Yeah. Awesome. So like I'll go back to my boundary thing. The first step is trying to attract people who are interested in the book, and the second step is to get critique, because it's the 2 things work with each other. So
yeah, because otherwise it'll be like one personal critique, like more people to and like try it. Loads of people have just hit me up on LinkedIn and stuff. They're like, we tried this, we're not sure about this, we tried this. So it's interesting. There's a little. And there are parallel ways of doing this. I'm not pretending I've created something. It's very interesting. People come up, and I've spoken to many people at open spaces and conferences and stuff. And they're like, we aren't doing what you're doing, but we're doing the same. We felt the same needs, and we've got a subtly different version of it.
Yeah.
So if you can see this from a different angle, I'd love to hear all that stuff. That's really interesting to me. So.
All right, Andrew. Thank you very much. Hope we'll talk again soon. After the book is more written, let's come back and hang out and read some of the chapters together or something. Cool.
Good times.
Thanks, Andrew. It was awesome
Cheers.
to see you. Bye. Just 2 seconds.